Great. So I am going to talk about conceptual engineering methods and methodologies. And just as a way into the discussion, I want to first of all note that I think there are two ways that conceptual engineering tends to be characterized in the literature. In the first of these ways, it's often characterized as a method or a process. So, for example, Kaplan says that fixing language is about the process of assessing and improving our representational devices, and he uses the term conceptual engineering for this enterprise. David Chalmers describes conceptual engineering as the process of designing, implementing, and evaluating concepts. And our host, Manuel Gustavo Isaac, wants to lay the theoretical foundations for making conceptual engineering an actionable method. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm just like method, process, refer to roughly the same thing here, but this is one way that conceptual engineering gets characterized in the literature. There is another way, and that is as a methodology. Jenny Nadeau says that conceptual engineering is a recently repopularized methodological approach which aims at the improvement of our current conceptual repertoire. Burgess and Plunkett say that the idea of many philosophers writing about conceptual engineering is that conceptual engineering is a way of talking about the thing, perhaps a series of issues and approach, or a methodology that is common between purportedly paradigmatic cases of conceptual engineering. And falling on both sides of the divide here, our host, Manuel Gustavo Isaac, also says at first glance, conceptual engineering offers an updated take on philosophical methodology as consisting of the study of our concepts. So sometimes it's a method or process, and sometimes it's a methodology or a methodological approach or something like that. Now, at this very early stage, I think there's a whole lot of questions that you might just be pondering, such as what is the difference between a method and a methodology? So which one of those things is conceptual engineering, or is it both? Does it really matter? And if so, why? Why not? If it does matter, then why are you talking about it in this venue? So, what are philosophers interested in conceptual engineering supposed to do with it, and how do we do it? These questions aren't like an advert for precisely what I'm gonna discuss herein, but more just to acknowledge that this is probably what you may well be thinking. And in part, you might be thinking this because philosophers haven't tended to distinguish that clearly between methods and methodologies, certainly not, I think, in analytic philosophy. But I think that, but there is a distinction to be drawn here, and I will draw it, or I will draw a distinction in this vicinity. And I will say that it does matter, and I'll try to say why I think it matters. And I'll give you some indication of why or what you should be doing with the distinction, or what you might want to do with it if you're interested in conceptual engineering. So that's kind of very roughly what I'm going to do. And so here's the official plan. I'm going to explain the distinction, or a distinction in the ballpark. I will call it the methodology distinction, but there are different ways of drawing these sorts of things. I'll then very briefly run through some conceptual engineering methods. I'll then say a little bit more about conceptual engineering methodologies. I will say roughly why keeping the distinction clear matters. And then, I'm not going to answer the question, is there a compelling conceptual engineering methodology? That's the name of the section. But I will say some things about what we might want a compelling conceptual engineering methodology to look like. So that's the plan. This is all kind of early stages. This is all very much, this presentation is very much pre-draft status, although some of the material at the end picks up on some forthcoming work, which I will advert you to at the relevant point. Okay, so to begin, the methodology distinction. Right, so as I said, it's not that commonly drawn, I think, in analytic philosophy, but it's pretty commonly drawn in the social sciences. So there's a whole textbook on methodology in social science that Clough and Nutbrown have written. It's in the 3rd edition. and right at the beginning, they draw the distinction. It's an important distinction for them. And they say the distinction can be seen in terms of methods as being some of the ingredients of research. They have specifically something a bit like processes for collecting and analyzing data, while methodology provides the reasons for using a particular research recipe. So it's more like a justificatory role. Ackley and True write that a methodology is a theory and analysis of how research does or should proceed, and methods are techniques for gathering, producing, and analyzing evidence. So again, methods here I think is understood pretty similarly, but methodology may be slightly different. But again, it's like it's a step back, more reflective. So I'm going to take something a bit like the Ackley and True definition and just try and tweak it so that it fits philosophy. And I mean, one obvious reason why we might think it needs tweaking is that philosophers don't tend to gather, produce, or analyze evidence that much, at least not as we standardly think of evidence. I mean, you could gloss intuitions in that way, maybe, if you wanted to, but we don't have to. But I think what philosophers tend to do really is more work with arguments. At least that's how philosophers tend to think about what they're doing. It's kind of the bread and butter of philosophy here is kind of constructing arguments and then representing and analyzing them. So I proposed kind of quite a natural way of reworking the definition of Ackley and True is to say philosophical methods are techniques for representing, constructing, and analyzing arguments. Sort of thing I have in mind here would include informal techniques, such as putting arguments into premise conclusion form. So that's just, that's a technique for representing arguments. Formal techniques involving symbolic representation. I mean, that's also pretty useful for analyzing arguments. Strategies for constructing arguments, such as reflecting on thought experiments. Processes for sharpening key terms, such as the method of explication. This is probably going to count as a technique for representing arguments. And I think I'm also happy to include here standard dialectical moves, such as raising an objection or biting the bullet, and so on. So I'm definitely using this definition broadly. And so construed, I think it's useful, or it's right to think of philosophical methods as tools within a philosopher's toolbox that she can apply in standard or surprising ways when tackling philosophical problems. Right, so that's roughly how I'm thinking of philosophical methods. I should say at this point that I don't really care about this definition, and nothing I say later on depends on it or uses it in any way, as far as I can tell. But it's useful for getting the distinction in place, right? That you have both sides of the distinction. So I'm quite happy to think of philosophical methods in other ways, and you're welcome to object to me later in the Q&A based on this. But I'm not too worried about whether or not this is exactly right. What I'm more interested in is how we think of a philosophical methodology. So the Ackley and True definition is that a methodology is a theory and analysis of how research does or should proceed. So the obvious way to think about a philosophical methodology is to say it's a theory and analysis of how philosophical research does or should proceed. But I happen to find here the does or should clause unhelpful. Firstly, I mean, this isn't maybe a hugely important issue, but it kind of just bothers me. The way that I read the definition, that first proposal, it sort of suggests that the does and the should are in some way separable, but I don't think that they have to be. At the very least, we might think that a theory and analysis of how philosophical research proceeds might be, say, like a rationalizing explanation, which is both at once kind of describing how something is and normative because it's rationalizing. So I find that a little bit unhelpful. But more importantly, I think the does or should is too strong, because as soon as we're thinking of a methodology as like, a theory and analysis of how philosophical research proceeds, then it seems arbitrary to rule out perfectly coherent ways of doing philosophical research, which it just so happens that nobody is yet doing, or nobody is doing. Right, so there may be unactualized, permissible ways of doing philosophical research that just no one has, no one's doing them yet. So to restrict the philosophical methodologies to ways that research is or should be done seems too strong, because there may be ways that that currently aren't, but really could and could permissibly philosophical research could be done. So I suggest that we just characterize a philosophical methodology as a theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. And as soon as you describe it in these terms, like a number of questions on the normative and descriptive perspective sort of arise. So you can say of a philosophical methodology. So I give you an analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. You might say to me, this is all well and good, but is this a permissible way for it to proceed? Or is this the way that we ought to be doing it? Is this the way that people actually do it? And we can ask questions like, is the methodology that in fact picks out the way people do research? Is that one of the permissible ways of doing it? Is that how people ought to do it? Are there multiple permissible ways of doing philosophical research? So on and so forth. So as soon as you have this, the second proposal, it doesn't eliminate the distinction between descriptive and normative or anything like that. It just suppresses it for the purpose of the definition. And those questions arise a step further down the line. Right, so that's what I'm proposing and that's going to be my working definition for philosophical methodology. Right, so we've now got a distinction on the table. Philosophical methods are techniques for representing, constructing, and analyzing arguments. And the philosophical methodology is a theory and an analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. I take it to be pretty obvious that there is, in fact, a distinction here. I don't think I need to argue that techniques aren't theories or anything like that. I take it that's reasonably clear. But a question does arise if we're trying to distinguish two things which people might have confused or perhaps don't normally distinguish, and that's, well, what is the relationship between them? How are methods and methodologies related? And two things that I just want to say on this front is a methodology doesn't mandate any particular method. So what I mean by that is that a methodology doesn't tell you you ought to use these particular methods. A methodology in general isn't something like a function from philosophical problems to philosophical methods. It doesn't tell you like this is the one way of doing it. Rather, it's better, I think, to think of a methodology as providing a theoretical perspective on the matters at hand, whatever they are, and it's a perspective from which a researcher justifies her research strategy and choice of methods. So a philosophical methodology, is a theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. If I, as a philosopher, buy into a particular philosophical methodology, then that is kind of capturing, or that is representing, or that is giving me a theoretical perspective on whatever problems I'm currently facing. And from that perspective, there will be there might be like one better way of approaching them, which will suggest to me certain methods. But two different philosophers might accept the same philosophical methodology, and they might use, say, subtly different methods in answering the question, some particular question. And that doesn't mean that one of them is doing it wrong. It's just that a philosophical methodology is a bit more general. It's a step back. It gives you sort of theoretical resources, a theoretical perspective on the matters at hand. Right, so that's kind of the relationship between methods and methodologies, and philosophical methods and philosophical methodologies in particular. Okay, right, so that's the distinction that I think is useful. And before I say any more about why it might be useful, I'm going to try and say a little bit more about how this applies to conceptual engineering. So conceptual engineering methods. And so I'm going to very briefly run through 3 conceptual engineering methods. And here's a good piece of evidence that this isn't, this talk is pre-draft, is that I'm not really sure if conceptual engineering methods will count as philosophical methods, as I've defined philosophical methods. I'm not really worried about that, because I don't think that conceptual engineering is somehow sort of distinctive of philosophy in any way. So if it turns out it's not a philosophical method, it doesn't mean that it can't be used in philosophy. But whatever, like if you have worries or thoughts about this, I'm very happy to hear them and to discuss them at the end. But I'm just going to assume that they are philosophical methods, but maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, conceptual engineering methods, whether or not they are philosophical, Amongst them are Carnap's method of explication. There are lots of ways of characterizing this. Here I'm characterizing it as a three-step process. You informally clarify the explicandum, highlighting the sense in which it is to be explicated. You define a suitable explicatum and use the explicatum instead of the explicandum within relevant contexts. This is a method for replacing one concept with another for theoretical purposes within a particular theoretical context. That's a conceptual engineering method. We can think of Haslanger's method, or we can think of ameliorative analysis as a method, at least as it's presented in Haslanger's 2000 paper. And I mean, again, for symmetry, I've presented it as a three-step process. You identify the political and theoretical purposes you want concept C to help you achieve. You then develop a revisionary definition of C that helps you to achieve those political and theoretical purposes. And then you use that revised definition to undertake those political and theoretical purposes. So again, something like this, I'm just going to call a conceptual engineering method. I think it's a method, and it falls. It looks to me like a conceptual engineering one. And what's the point of giving a talk if you're not going to cite yourself? So the speaker meeting approach is another conceptual engineering method, as far as I'm concerned. Step 1, design and you definiens M for term T. Step 2, you stipulate that T will be used to speaker mean M in local contexts. At step 3, you use T to speaker mean M in local contexts. Very simple method for kind of easy local conceptual engineering, something like that. Yeah, and I mean, this is the kind of thing that to me really probably wouldn't count as a philosophical method according to my initial definition, because I mean, maybe it's useful for, I don't know, representing arguments, maybe, but really it's just broader than that. It's more like introducing theoretical terminology or something. Anyway, that's by the by. So these are conceptual engineering methods. 3 examples for you to indicate the sorts of things that I'm calling methods. I've presented them all as step-by-step procedures. They don't have to be quite so well formulated. They can be a bit looser, but that's the sort of thing that I have in mind. Okay, conceptual engineering methodologies. So there's my definition again. It's a theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. It's a theory and an analysis. Theories, it can be useful to think of them as answering questions. So what kind of questions does a philosophical methodology answer? Here are the sorts of questions it might answer. What kind of thing is philosophy? Is philosophy an inquiry, a way of life? Some people have said that, or is it something else? A methodology might say what the aim of philosophy is. If philosophy is an inquiry, then maybe the aim of philosophy is truth. Maybe it's understanding. If philosophy is a way of life, maybe the aim of philosophy is flourishing. What is the nature of philosophical problems? Are they just questions? So we might think the question, what is knowledge? Or is free will compatible with determinism? Are those questions philosophical problems, or are philosophical problems sort of like puzzles that underlie that? As I read Strawson's critique of Carnap, he's thinking of philosophical problems as kind of being conceptual imbalances. We have these concepts and we apply them in ways that seem to lead us to certain tensions that suggest we reach conclusions that we somehow ought not to reach given our concepts. So there's a puzzle there to work out, like what's happening? How do we resolve this conceptual imbalance? So what is the nature of philosophical problems? What are the objects of philosophical problems? If we think of them as questions, are they questions about our concepts? Are they questions about phenomena? Are they about the concept of knowledge, or is it about knowledge per se? Which topics and problems are philosophically interesting and important? What kind of methods are appropriate for tackling philosophical problems? And how do these methods make progress in philosophy? So understood. Right, so the last couple of questions deserve some comment, and they're quite important here. So a methodology is a theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed. Part of that is saying, of giving one way of conceptualizing and thinking about philosophy. Another part of that is saying how we're going to think about or interpret philosophical problems. Another part of that is to say what kind of methods will be useful for actually tackling those problems. But also, it's quite important to tie this all together. You need to say also, like, how do these methods make progress in philosophy given the aim? So if philosophy's got an aim and we've got a way of interpreting philosophical problems, then we need to have the methodologies that indicate what kind of methods will actually solve those problems and why, and how that's going to help us achieve the aims of philosophy. Right? If it's going to be a convincing theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed, you need to tie these bits up, and you need a lot of these different components. So philosophical methodology, I think, is going to be certainly a compelling one. Is going to be answering quite a lot of questions, and these are the sorts of things it's going to be answering, sort of questions. So a few kind of examples. You might think of logical empiricism. Certainly, I'm imagining it here in the Carnap, Aufbau sort of vein, where you think of philosophy as, I guess, kind of part of an inquiry, which is all where scientific inquiry is the ideal form, or what you're aiming for, and where the way that you do this is you formulate questions in a language which is empirically grounded. So how do you do philosophy? Well, you try to reformulate those questions within a language that's empirically grounded, and then you tackle them that way. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how you might think, what you might think philosophy is like, what you might think philosophical problems are like, and how you go about tackling them. Ordinary language philosophy, if you think about philosophy in the, I'll just here go back to that kind of Strawson conceptual imbalance line. If you think of philosophy in that way, then the way you're going to tackle philosophical problems are going to be pretty different to how I just described the logical empiricist tackling them. You're going to be doing something much more like, which will look more like a method of conceptual analysis rather than a method of conceptual engineering. And then in the more recent literature, you've got a whole host of different kind of what I think of as broadly methodologies, accounts of the sorts of thing that, so all of these give some sort of account of at least what philosophical problems are, maybe what the aim of philosophy is, give you some idea of the kind of the methods that might be useful, and how those methods are construed, or how those methods tackle the problems so construed, and so on. So that's this is how I'm thinking of philosophical methodologies and some examples. So conceptual engineering methodologies. So I've just said a little bit more about what a philosophical methodology is, and I've given you some examples. So let's just say that a conceptual engineering philosophical methodology is a theory and analysis of a way for philosophical research to proceed, but one on which conceptual engineering methods have a or the central role to play when tackling solving philosophical problems. And the kind of examples here we have, so logical empiricism, as I just mentioned it, a key part of that is going to be transforming our problems in our ordinary language into the language of the Aufbau, but the relevant scientific language. So that's probably going to involve some kind of explication. Then you've got Haslanger's ameliorative project, which I take to be well known enough that I won't go through the details. Sharp's radical therapeutic program. So he has an account of philosophy as kind of like an investigation into our inconsistent concepts. And the purpose of philosophy, according to Sharp, is effectively to clean up our concepts and then to outsource them to science. So the thought is that, say, the concept of knowledge is inconsistent, so it's not really denoting anything, but there may well be interesting things out there in the world to investigate. So what philosophy does is it tidies up the concept, and then scientists come along and investigate the thing that the tidied up concepts denote. Right, so again, that gives you a particular view of what sort of thing philosophy is and what kind of things philosophical problems are, but one which puts conceptual engineering at center stage when it comes to tackling them. Okay, so that's what a conceptual engineering philosophical methodology is, and a few brief examples. Okay, right, how am I doing? Good, right, so why keeping the distinction clear matters. And okay, so there's a sense in which keeping the distinction clear matters because it's actually a distinction, and if you don't draw it, you're going to be confused, and it's better not to be confused. And that's kind of a roughly why it matters. But in the context of discussions about conceptual engineering, I'm going to draw out three more specific examples that I think are sort of useful just to kind of think through. Right, so the first one is keeping clear on who has and what is the burden of argument. Right, so if you don't draw or carefully draw the distinction between methods or methodologies, or at least keep it in mind, then the sort of thing you're going to think is that here's a conceptual engineering method, but that is a methodology in the sense that my method is my theory about how you do philosophy, right? That a method, giving a method is the same as giving you like a good coherent theory of how to do philosophy. So a supporter of conceptual engineering who doesn't keep the distinction clear may conflate the difference, or may conflate the following: developing a method of conceptual engineering and developing a method for tackling and solving philosophical problems. They may think that in giving a method of conceptual engineering, they are giving a method that is useful for tackling and solving philosophical problems. But as soon as you distinguish between methods and methodologies, you see that there's a gap between these two things. And you can't, something being a method of conceptual engineering isn't automatically a method for tackling and solving philosophical problems. It's really only against the backdrop of a suitable methodology that you can make that inference that a method of conceptual engineering is a method for tackling and solving philosophical problems. You need to have a theory of the kind of thing that philosophy is, the kind of thing that philosophical problems are, that's going to say or make it plausible that that method is going to be useful for tackling those kinds of problems. Okay, and now I'm going to pick on someone who, Erik Olsen, who at least according to me at this particular time makes this kind of mistake. No doubt I'm being unfair on Olsen and I'm being uncharitable, but this is, I think, at least one plausible reading of what he's doing here. So according to Olsen, so he develops what he calls explicative epistemology. And what he's specifically arguing in this paper, this 2015 paper, is that Carnap's method of explication can be used to solve the Gettier problem. Right, so the Gettier problem is a problem about knowledge, cases of justified true belief that look like they intuitively aren't knowledge. And what he wants to do is show that you can explicate the concept of knowledge and end up with something that deems Gettier cases to be cases of knowledge. Right, so he gives this method and he uses it and he sort of takes himself to have got a solution to the Gettier problem. So why does he think he can do this? He gives us two reasons for the thinking that you can use the method of explication in this way. The first is that Carnap's method is older by 10 years than the Gettier problem. Right, so that's the first reason that he gives for thinking that's a suitable, that this is good. And the second one is, and this is kind of within a paragraph, but this I think is fairly distilling down, I think, the key point that's being made, and that's that philosophical definitions are no different in principle from scientific ones, and in both cases the method of explication is to be recommended. But I mean, I've just really, on its own, it seems to me that this isn't really giving you a justification for thinking that the method of explication can actually solve philosophical problems, unless you think that the philosophical problem is simply a problem of something like designing philosophical definitions or giving a definition. So what it seems to me is going on here is that Olsen is giving, he's appealing to a method of conceptual engineering, the method of explication, and he's kind of just taking it to be a method for solving philosophical problems. The point about age is just to show that the method is, it's not ad hoc. The method was come up with first, so it's not a method which has just been designed, given the problem, it's not just been designed just to solve that particular problem, so it's not ad hoc. And the second point, I think, is just kind of a hand-wavy gesture to try to appease the slightly skeptical reader. But it seems to me that this just does not meet the burden of argument. If you want to use the method of explication to solve the Gettier problem, then you really need to tell us how you're understanding the get-it problem in such a way that it really makes sense to be using the method replication to solve that problem. What is the problem? What is it about? Why is replacing one concept with another going to count as giving us a solution? So I think here the burden of argument also needs to do this. Because he's not carefully distinguishing between method and methodology, he doesn't realize he needs to do it, so he doesn't. Right, so I think it's important to get clear on who has the burden of argument in various situations. The contours of methodological space. I thought that sounded nice, which is why I phrased it in that way. But I mean, really what I have in mind here is getting clear on how, like, with different methods and methodologies, like what is in competition. If you object to one, like what are you objecting to? What do you need to motivate? How do these things interact? I mean, it will become clearer in a second exactly what I mean here. But suppose that a supporter of conceptual engineering who does not keep the methodology distinction clear, so they may reason as follows. One, conceptual engineering methods are quite different to conceptual analysis methods, right? So quite different here in the sense of, let's say with respect to a particular case, they'll give you a different answer. So conceptual engineering method as applied to, say, a get-it problem or the question, what is knowledge, will give you one answer, but a conceptual analysis method will give you another. And you might think, if you're not drawing this distinction that carefully, then you're going to kind of just think, well, look, these methods just give you different answers to the question. So clearly one of them is right and one of them is wrong. And that's kind of it. So these methodologies are just in competition. These different ways of approaching philosophy are just in competition with each other because, you know, one of them, at most, one of them can be right. Right, so you're moving from 1 to 2 as they're listed there. But what's important to realize is that methodology, so methods is just like a process for doing something, right? So they get you different answers, they look like they're in competition. But a methodology has a huge number of more resources than that. And a methodology, it's a theory and analysis of a way of doing philosophy. So as soon as you appeal to these methodologies, you step back and you realize that you can have 2 different ways of thinking about philosophy and philosophical problems, which suggest different methods. And both of those can be perfectly coherent ways of thinking about the issues without them being in competition, right? So what you need to really move from methods give you different answers to the methodologies are in competition with each other is something like a methodological monism, the view that there's only one correct philosophical methodology. If you have that assumption in place, then I think 2 is going to follow from 1. But if you don't, then it simply doesn't. You can say, well, look, there are different ways of doing philosophy. And as long as they are kind of coherent and make sense, then there's no obvious reason to think that they're actually in competition with each other. So this time I'm going to almost certainly unfairly pick on Jenny Nadeau. I'm even more convinced that I'm being uncharitable on this occasion, but she'll survive. So Nadeau criticizes methods of conceptual analysis, the standard model is what she calls it, and then writes that a growing number of philosophers have begun to suggest that we depart from the standard model and its dogged pursuit of conceptual analysis towards a more revisionary venture, conceptual engineering. Now, the way that I understand Nadeau here is that what she's doing is she is motivating conceptual engineering by criticizing conceptual analysis. But that assumes that these things are basically in competition, right? That you make one slightly more plausible or make one more appealing by showing that the other one is less appealing. But for that kind of thing to work, you have to have this kind of methodological monism or something like that in the background, which Nadeau doesn't mention at all. And I think really what Nadeau needs to be doing, if she wants to motivate conceptual engineering, she just needs to motivate conceptual engineering. She needs to give a plausible methodology in favor of conceptual engineering. It's actually presenting criticisms of conceptual analysis is neither here nor there. If conceptual analysis is a bad way of doing philosophy, then that says nothing about whether or not conceptual engineering is a good way of doing it. Unless we appeal to something like methodological monism, which Nadeau doesn't. And I mean, just to be fair to Nato, like she does go on and do some of the positive stuff in that paper as well. But it's this kind of beginning section where it is very much like she's motivating conceptual engineering by objecting to conceptual analysis. But yeah, so. But as they're not in competition, at least not without this assumption of methodological monism, it seems that objecting to one doesn't motivate the other. Okay, so that's another reason. If you don't keep this distinction in mind, then you won't be clear on the contours of methodological space, and you won't have a clear sense of what you need to do and what is in to motivate your picture, or what is in competition with what. Okay, and the final thing I'm going to mention is getting clear on objections. So it's important for critics of conceptual engineering to keep the methodology distinction clear, because if they don't, then they may fail to raise a serious criticism at all. And I'm going to briefly mention the change of subject objection. So obviously this is typically associated with Strawson as an objection to Carnap, and very, very crudely, it's conceptual engineering or explication changes the subject, so it's inappropriate, don't do it, waste of time. So that's a very, very crude version of the objection. Okay, now the thought is this, that if you apply it to either conceptual engineering methods or conceptual engineering methodologies, it doesn't look very convincing. Or at least it's much, much less convincing than some critics take it to be. So aimed at conceptual engineering methods. And okay, in one sense, it doesn't really make sense. So there's nothing wrong with changing subjects per se, right? And just to sort of point this out, consider the simple method of dealing with an awkward pause in a conversation by saying, what's everyone up to this weekend? Or if you're in Britain, you'd say, well, it's inclement weather today, isn't it? Right, and that's so like just changing the subject isn't objectionable in general. And now a method is just a method for doing something. So if it's so it's just not an objection to a method that it changed the subject per se. It's just a process, and if it involves changing the subject, it involves changing the subject. That's fine. I mean, someone might say, well, I mean, it's okay. It is a little bit more subtle than this, because I think that Strawson's objection to Carnap, you can kind of see Strawson as saying explication is a method for clarifying concepts, but it doesn't clarify them. It just changes the subject, right? It replaces one concept with another. But that's really, I think, a misconstrual of the objection, or at least of the method of explication. And really, it's what's Carnap thinks of explication as a method for replacing one concept with another, and then maybe he uses it to clarify concepts. And at most, I think you might think that this objection is going to apply to a particular use of a method. So here's a method which replaces one concept with another, and in so doing changes the subject. So don't use that to clarify concepts. And I think maybe at that level, this objection can be made to work. But it's quite important. It's quite clear, I think, that the vast majority of people talking about conceptual engineering at the moment, like that's not what's going on. The discussions around conceptual engineering aren't just about clarifying concepts in this kind of way. So really, just I think just aimed at conceptual engineering methods per se, it doesn't really make sense. And for someone to push this line of objection, focusing on the way that conceptual engineering methods are used, like today in the literature, I think the critics got quite a lot of work in really making a convincing case that it's used in a way which changes the subject when it shouldn't. So anyway, so I mean, the thought is just that it's difficult to see how this objection really works when applied to methods. At least a lot of work is required. There's no simple objection here. And what about aimed at conceptual engineering methodologies? I think it targets a straw man. Right. So here is a very simple conceptual engineering methodology. Philosophical problems are questions interpreted in their ordinary sense, like what is knowledge? And according to this straw man methodology, we are to use conceptual engineering methods simply to change the meanings of the words essential to formulating those questions. right? So how do we solve the question? How do we solve the philosophical problem? What is knowledge? Well, the problem is just that question interpreted in, let's say, ordinary English, and we're going to solve it by simply changing the meaning of the word English. Oh, sorry, of the word knowledge. Now, clearly, that methodology won't really work because by its own lights, it shouldn't be changing the subject, but it is. Like it's suggesting that you do something that really you shouldn't be. And so against that methodology, it seems that the change of subject objection works. But who said that? I mean, I don't think I've ever seen someone say that we should interpret philosophical questions in their precisely ordinary everyday sense, and we're going to solve them by changing the meanings of the words that we use to formulate the question. I don't think this is a particularly plausible view, and I'm not really sure that anyone's really pushed that view. Anyone that presents a conceptual engineering methodology has to present a plausible case or plausible way of interpreting questions that make sense of why we might use conceptual engineering to tackle those questions or to tackle philosophical problems. So aim of conceptual engineering methodologies, I think it just targets the straw man. Yeah, so the objector, I think what the objector is basically doing here is they see that that someone's proposing a particular method, and they think that they're just using that, they're not distinguishing methods and methodologies, so they think that the method is to be applied to philosophical problems as they're ordinarily understood, as they're typically understood, in a quite a straightforward way. And I think they end up just targeting the straw man, in fact, the straw man methodology, because they haven't realized that that the conceptual engineer can give a different methodology. There are different methodological options. There are better methodologies than that straw man naive one. So I think there's a good case to be made that the change of subject objection just doesn't, it's either going to be obscure, or it doesn't really get off the ground, or it's going to be tough to make work when you get clear on that methodology distinction. And I think it only really looks plausible when someone thinks that that the conceptual engineer is proposing that we just do something like use explication to answer ordinary everyday questions about, say, the nature of knowledge. Right, then it looks sensible, but that really comes about because someone hasn't properly drawn the distinction between method and methodology. Okay, so there's a whole load of reasons to think that the distinction might matter. So now we get on to section 5. Is there a compelling conceptual engineering methodology? And in a sense, the answer is yes, and I'm going to give you a brief sketch of it. But of course, that's probably false. The fact that I've come up with something probably doesn't make it compelling, as referees regularly tell me. But let's start off by giving you some desiderata for what we want in a compelling conceptual engineering methodology. And by compelling, I mean something like active philosophers are going to find it plausible, or something a bit like that. Right, so 3 things I'm going to give you. The conceptual engineering methodology should provide a plausible and familiar aim for philosophy. I mean, we could design a conceptual engineering methodology that says something like, the point of philosophy is to completely change how we talk about everything, right? And then of course, we're going to solve problems by using conceptual engineering, but no one's going to think that that's a plausible or compelling conceptual engineering methodology, because it's just radically changing the aim of philosophy. So the kind of thing that I would like to go for is something like philosophy is an inquiry and it's aiming at truth or understanding, something like that. Right, so we want a conceptual engineering methodology to provide a plausible, familiar aim for philosophy, something that people are going to take seriously. We want it to give us a strategy for interpreting philosophical problems that does not deviate too radically from how they are traditionally interpreted. So one way of interpreting philosophical problems is simply, in the kind of way I've been talking about, is just as kind of questions, like understood in the ordinary tongue, in ordinary English or whatever. And maybe so interpreted, it's going to be unclear exactly how conceptual engineering is going to really play a really central role. So perhaps a conceptual engineering methodology is going to have to provide a slightly different interpretation of philosophical problems, perhaps. But whatever it does, the methodology is going to have to give us some strategy for doing this, and the interpretation that we give of philosophical problems is going to have to deviate not too much from how others are thinking about them. right? Because we want them to think, okay, yeah, that's a plausible interpretation of that problem. I see where you're going with this. And the third thing that a compelling conceptual engineering methodology should do is it should make transparent how and why conceptual engineering methods would be suitable to tackling and solving the philosophical problems so interpreted. So I think it's not enough to simply say, here are, this is how I'm going to interpret philosophical problems, and then give a sort of a long and difficult argument about why conceptual engineering might be suitable for solving them in some circumstances. What you really want is for the reader to say, okay, yeah, that's a plausible way to interpret philosophical problems. And oh yeah, now I see, if I interpret them in that way, then yeah, of course, conceptual engineering is going to be like an appropriate way for solving them. Yep, that seems great, good. And it doesn't mean that obviously people have to agree with you, but it's just, if you want this to be a compelling conceptual engineering methodology, I think these are three things that you really need. You need to provide a plausible aim for philosophy, give a sensible interpretation of philosophical problems, and really make it clear how and why conceptual engineering methods are going to be suitable for solving them and why they're going to be the right approach. Okay, so that's what I think we want. So is there a compelling conceptual engineering methodology? If I hadn't spent the first, I don't know, 50, 55 minutes, whatever it is, of this talk, sort of building up to this point, of course, I'd now go back and I'd argue that Sharpe's methodology, the Haslang's methodology, and the logical empiricist methodology don't satisfy these desiderata. I'm not sure if they do or they don't, and I'm not really too worried about that, because it's just, I'm really just more interested in sort of the more strategic points. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to give a very simple example, which is something that I've been working on recently, and which is forthcoming, or it's featured in more detail in a forthcoming paper in Field Studies. And this is going to be super brief, right? So it's not, so I mean, feel free to ask questions about it, but this isn't the whole story. There's subtleties. But okay, so we can think of philosophy as aiming at truth or understanding, and it's an inquiry. We think of it as an inquiry into phenomena. And I'm here thinking of like a Williamson style line. So as a starting point, you can think of, say, epistemology as an investigation into knowledge, right? Not the concept of knowledge, not how people talk about knowledge, but knowledge. But, right, and then this is the slight twist on that. Although we, as in philosophers, we start by investigating the phenomena we think are interesting, like knowledge, we might turn out to be wrong. So just brief analogy, astronomers in the last century were investigating a particular category, right, which included Mercury through to Pluto, and they thought that that was an interesting astronomical category, but it turned out that they were wrong. The interesting astronomical category includes Mercury through to Neptune, but not Pluto, right? So they were investigating a phenomenon that they thought was interesting, but they got it slightly wrong. And I mean, of course, how do they find out they were wrong? Well, they engineered the concept of planet is one of the things that they did. So we think that the question, what is knowledge, is interesting. And we're happy to say things like epistemology is the study of knowledge, because we think that knowledge is interesting. But on the way that I'm proposing we think about this, or according to this methodology, we might be wrong, right? It might turn out that the concept of, that knowledge isn't the interesting thing in the vicinity. So given this, so how do we think of philosophical problems? Well, we normally think of them, let's say, as big questions like, what is knowledge, and is free will compatible with determinism, and things like that. But rather than thinking of these big questions sort of like as the philosophical problems, the suggestion is that we instead think of these big questions as mere glosses of the underlying philosophical problems. So when we ask the question, what is knowledge? What we're doing is we're glossing a philosophical problem, and we're glossing them in a way that makes sense, given the assumption that knowledge is epistemologically interesting. But it might not be the thing that's interesting. So what exactly is the philosophical problem? Well, to get at that, we need to present the question, what is knowledge, in a way which sort of filters out the assumption that knowledge is the interesting thing in the vicinity. How exactly do we do that? There might be different ways. I'm doing it here as a combination of 4 questions. So the first one is, what different epistemic states can one be in? Which of those states are theoretically interesting? Are any of those theoretically interesting states similar in salient respects with our everyday understanding of knowledge? Right here, the word knowledge is denoting a particular word, right? So it's our everyday understanding, or perhaps it would be better to say something like with everyday connotations of knowledge or something like that. And if so, in what ways? So the idea is that when we're asking the question, what is knowledge, according to this methodology, we're really posing the question in a way which simply assumes that knowledge is the interesting thing in the vicinity. But if we filter out that assumption, then we'll get like a whole host of a bundle of questions, like along the lines of these here. Right. So what are the interesting epistemic states? Which of those are a bit like knowledge? And like, what is, if one of them is like knowledge, like in what way is it like knowledge? Okay, and it's clear, and by it's clear, a couple of sentences will be needed to say why it's clear, but it's reasonably clear, I think, how something like the method of explication or conceptual engineering method might be used to answer questions A to D reasonably directly. Why? Well, what A to D are encouraging you to do is basically work out what is an interesting or useful epistemological taxonomy. And the kind of way you're going to do that is by doing something like starting off with our ordinary everyday terms and replacing them with terms that are more precisely defined in a way which gets you a more fruitful and useful theoretical taxonomy. And then you're going to look at whether your explication of the concept of knowledge is in your final interesting taxonomy. And if it is, then you're going to say in what ways it's similar or dissimilar to our everyday understanding, or our everyday understanding of knowledge, or how we're understanding that. So something like the method of explication is going to suddenly be reasonably clearly, I think, a useful way for tackling the question, what is knowledge? But on the understanding, right, that the question, what is knowledge, is a gloss for these kind of something like these questions. Right, so that's a way of thinking about what philosophy is doing, which I think is reasonably standard. It gives it a slight tweak, but then it gives us a way of understanding philosophical problems, which is, again, a slight tweak on a pretty standard way of thinking about them, but in a way which I think then makes pretty clear why a conceptual engineering method would be useful for solving those, for answering those questions, right? Because the method of explication is going to give us a way to answer A to D, I think, reasonably straightforwardly. Oh, and the citation, Pinder forthcoming. That's helpful, isn't it? Good. Okay, so closing remarks. So this is like me telling you what I want to do going forward, but I mean, I kind of also like I want to encourage others to do the same, because obviously I want to do it because I think they're good things to do. I want to keep the methodology distinction clear. I don't think I have always done so, and I don't think others have always done so too. And I want to do that because I think it's important. I want to get clearer on how to think of philosophical methods and philosophical methodologies. As will have been clear much earlier on, I'm really not that clear on how best to think of philosophical methods at the moment. I'm much happier with how I'm thinking about philosophical methodologies, but there may be better ways. Others will have other thoughts. I want to encourage critics to engage with and understand the distinction when discussing conceptual engineering, so that they don't think that their ultra powerful objections, so they don't think that their confused objections are ultra powerful ones, right? But I just want people to like get the distinction, understand how it's involved, and use it. I want to recognize the plurality of philosophical methodologies and let 1,000 flowers bloom. This would have, I mean, this was in the background earlier, but it may well have come across that I don't think that conceptual engineering is the way of doing philosophy. I certainly don't think that what I presented in the previous slide is like the one correct methodology within conceptual engineering or more broadly. But recognizing that there are a plurality of them is, I think, compatible with wanting people to be much clearer in developing what exactly they're doing, and making that explicit and putting that as a more center, putting that at more center stage when people are adopting whatever approach to philosophy they want to adopt. And finally, I want to continue to develop and actually apply conceptual engineering philosophical methodology. So I want to continue to work on like how we should think about philosophy, or not how we should, of how we can think about philosophy and philosophical problems, how we can develop or theorize about this way of doing philosophical research in a way which makes it compelling and interesting and give us interesting answers. Because I think it can and it does, but I think that often there's been a lot of focus on the foundations of philosophical methods. But actually, from a philosophical perspective, I think the methodological questions are the more rich and interesting and more widely applicable as well. So these are the things that I want to do. And I hope that some of you and some of those that aren't here will join me in doing some of these things. That's it.